Robert T. Daly Jr. is professor of English at Texas State University. He's the author of Kurt Vonnegut and the American Novel, A Postmodern Iconography, and the editor of Kurt Vonnegut Critical Insights. Daly's latest book is For a Ruthless Critique of All That Exists, Literature in an Age of Capitalist Realism. And let me just say that's a fantastic title.
Thanks. A young Marx gets credit for the title. I just borrowed it, but should I go ahead then and read first? Okay, mine is a little longer than I wanted. It'll probably go a little over 20 minutes, but no more than 25, I hope. And I hope it makes sense.
There are perks to a two-person panel, so enjoy.
Okay. Yeah, my title is Vonnegut Against Vonnegut, or the Perils of Misanthropic Humanism. One of the leading humorists in the post-war American literature, Kurt Vonnegut has garnered an enormous fan base of devoted readers enamored with his personable voice, pithy style, biting satire, and philosophical, if sometimes curmudgeonly, worldview. This appreciation has only grown since his death in 2007, during which time a number of posthumous publications have appeared. All of his books remain in print. His presence in popular culture, as observed especially on the internet, has never been more visible. Moreover, critical appreciations of Vonnegut have kept pace with the public appeal. A scholarly society devoted to his work was formed in 2009. The first professional biography of the author appeared in 2011. The Kurt Vonnegut Memorial Library and Museum now operates in the author's native Indianapolis. In 2021, Robert Whitey's long-anticipated documentary about the author, titled Kurt Vonnegut Unstuck in Time, was glowing reviews. And I just checked, 90% critics rating on Rotten Tomatoes, so that's to Robert Whitey. Vonnegut is not merely a beloved author, but he's become something of a guru or wise man to his legions of fans. It's a bit ironic, given Vonnegut's own doubts about gurus. He is the creator of Bokononism, after all, the religion based entirely on lies. And yet, as with his memorable self-described mountebank Bokonon from the novel Cat's Cradle, the adulation for Vonnegut is rooted in the very untruths that the author sought to expose. In Vonnegut's case, his troubling positions on individual subjectivity, personal freedom, family, race, sex, religion, nationalism, and economics could potentially invite skepticism with respect to his off-stated beliefs in secular humanism and socialism. Much of the time, Vonnegut himself concedes this, even if his readers refuse to believe it. In his own writing, Vonnegut mingles self-criticism with, and as part of, his folksy wisdom and transient observations. But many casual and even diehard fans tend to insist upon both his infallibility and his omnibenevolence, which is quite at odds with the truth that he himself presents, and which also tends to be unfairly dismissive of the legitimate criticisms of others, and these have included women, immigrants, and persons of color. My comments today derive from a larger project in which I argue that the popular image of Vonnegut and his work is largely based on misperceptions of the man, his writing, and his general worldview. In particular, I argue that some of Vonnegut's ostensibly progressive or radical politics is in fact much more complicated and sometimes troubling, as it sometimes supports, if not endorses, racist, sexist, xenophobic, or otherwise reactionary positions. In most cases, Vonnegut's wry outlooks undergirds a fundamentally quietist stance in which the attempt to improve the plight of mankind is pronounced doomed from the very beginning, and thus condemned as a waste of everyone's time. Much of the time, Vonnegut himself concedes this, even if some of his fawning readers refuse to believe it. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on a discrete example, which brings together issues of race, censorship, and professional ethics, matters that are, alas, all too timely today, as we see school boards and legislatures in dozens of states, introducing measures to remove books from libraries and classrooms, and denouncing critical race theory as they imagine it, and otherwise interfering with teaching and reading. Among his many virtues, Vonnegut is quite rightly remembered as a champion of free speech and an opponent of censorship, particularly with respect to literature and the arts. His own work has been subject to school and library bans, and in one notorious case in North Dakota, a school's janitor burned 32 copies of Slaughterhouse-Five. In a 1973 letter republished in his autobiographical collage, as he called it, Palm Sunday, Vonnegut admonished that school board for its, quote, ignorant, harsh, un-American policy, and added that, quote, books are sacred to free men for very good reasons, and wars have been fought against nations that hate books and burn them. Readers of Palm Sunday, if not readers in general, would likely applaud this position. The main reason for the Drake, North Dakota ban was that Slaughterhouse-Five contained a dirty word, specifically motherfucker, and that was the argument why it shouldn't be allowed in the school. We've seen other books challenged for their use of offensive language. One of Vonnegut's literary heroes, Mark Twain, wrote a book in which the narrator uses one of the most offensive and racist terms there is, and does so over 200 times. Partly for that reason, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has been challenged, banned, censored, or bowdlerized in recent years. A decade ago, for example, a New South edition of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn substituted the word slave for the offensive epithet, ludicrous as this switcheroo obviously was, especially to anyone who's read the novel and realizes that the person in question was not a slave at that time. And also that slave and that word are in no way synonymous. Vonnegut would undoubtedly disapprove of making any such changes to Twain's book or to other works of literature for any reason. But how do we feel about an author whitewashing his or her own work? This is the curious case of Hal Irwin's Magic Lamp, a short story first published in 1957. Vonnegut short story. A number of Vonnegut's early short stories were made more popular by their inclusion in his best-selling collection, Welcome to the Monkey House, 1968, and many more were simply forgotten until the combination of Peter Reed's superb study of Vonnegut's short fiction, as well as the publication of Bagombo's Snuff Box, a collection of previously uncollected short stories, published in 1999. Hal Irwin's Magic Lamp is special. Arguably, it has appeared in 4 different versions, enough to make it unique among Vonnegut's overall body of work. Hal Irwin's Magic Lamp was published in Cosmopolitan magazine in June 1957. It was then included, along with 11 other stories, in Vonnegut's first collection called Canary in a Coal Mine. I'm sorry, that's my mistake. It's called Canary in a Cat House is the name of the collection. I read it wrong here. Canary in a Cat House is the 1961 collection. And even there, it was slightly modified, just very slightly. The final line of the original story was omitted, but no other changes were made. I'll come back to that final line. Even more noticeable, perhaps, Hal Irwin's Magic Lamp is the only one of the 12 from Canary in a Coal Mine that was not included in the expanded and far better known collection, Welcome to the Monkey House, Canary in a Cat House, sorry. The only one, which does make it seem to stand out as a kind of absent presence, and almost makes me feel like it counts as a sort of invisible third version of the tale, since the silence speaks volumes. Finally, in connection with this scholarly project, Reed prevailed upon Vonnegut in the 1990s to allow him to collect and republish most of the formerly uncollected tales in Bagombo's Snuff Box, which is the name of one of the stories. That's also the title of the collection, though. But even there, Vonnegut saw fit to dramatically revise Hal Irwin's Magic Lamp, changing not only the tone and the language, but much of the plot itself. In fact, it's an astonishing act of self-censorship. because it completely alters the original while claiming by use of the same title to be reprinting a story from the 50s. In his afterword to the book, Vonnegut confesses changing the tale, but he does not explain how or why, other than that, quote, the denouement was so asinine. For those unfamiliar with the tale, and I'm assuming most people are, unless you've tracked down the Cosmopolitan, as I did through Interlibrary Loan, I'll briefly summarize. It's set in 1929, and Hal Irwin, unbeknownst to his young wife of 2 years, has struck it rich in the stock market. He maintains the ruse of their modest middle-class poverty, and his good-natured wife, Mary, never complains. Irwin then decides to surprise her by creating an elaborate ruse. He contrives to turn a teapot into a magic lamp and hires a black servant named Ella Washington, who is a pregnant woman that goes into labor during the ordeal. Inexplicably, in the 1995 version, Vonnegut changed her name to Ella Rice and made other changes to her character as well. But he hires a black servant, Ella Washington, to play a genie, J-I-N-N-I, genie, and arranges to have his wife wish for fine things, of course, he's already purchased and can now provide as her wishes come true. The plan backfires, for Mary takes his miracles to be signs that he was dissatisfied with his marriage and with her. So, for example, Hal tells her that he's hired a cook, really the genie, and Mary takes that as an insult to her cooking. He has her wish for a nice car, then a fine house, and the genie makes them appear. At last, Mary bursts out into tears, claiming to have never wanted any of that, quote, greedy stuff. She makes a final wish that, quote, the lamp would take back the car and the house and everything else. Then we learn, with the stock market crash, that Hal Irwin really did lose everything, including all of these luxuries. And then suddenly the story, and very awkwardly, returns to the present, the 50s, I guess, very awkwardly returns to the present, and we now see the aged, relatively happy couple with their teenage daughter. We learn that Ella's son has grown up to be, quote, a big, handsome man, a doctor. In the last scene, Mary and Hal share slices from a pear, fruit of the same tree that had grown in the yard of the mansion that he had bought, a sweet domestic image. In the final line, and this is the one undoubtedly that Vonnegut himself objected to later, in the final line, the first person narrator jumps in and says, quote, personally, I never forgave her for the depression. The whole thing is a setup, I guess, to the idea that by wishing away all of the luxury that she caused the depression. This is the final line, as I said, that was left out of the Canary in a Cat House version. And it really does seem appropriate to drop. As much as I can enjoy the Slaughterhouse-Five-like interpolation of the narrator, who suddenly revealed himself to have a personal stake in the Daly was, that he appeared to be a third-person narrator of, the abrupt one-liner joke ending is, as Vonnegut later suggested, rather asinine. However, even with the line, this doesn't explain why Vonnegut would choose to drop Hal Irwin's magic lamp entirely from Welcome to the Monkey House. Vonnegut reported to Peter Reed that he didn't even remember why he dropped it, although he did recall having complete control over selecting the stories for both collections. The omission, I think, thus sort of cries out for some speculation. Reed's own surmises go like this, quote, one might imagine that some of the precepts of the story, like giving the wife an allowance and generally making decisions for her, though fictionally grounded in the 1920s, was less comfortable to a 1968 audience than they would have been to one in 1957. A lot had changed in that decade. The same might be argued about the caricaturing of the Chinese-American English and the extensive black dialogue, black dialect in quotes. So Reed sort of suggests a vaguely feminist explanation, which, with the potential racism as a secondary thought, which strikes me as pretty unlikely, to be honest, and I can come back to that. But in his review of Peter Reed's study, Donald Morse, a well-known Vonnegut scholar, became rather irritated over even asking the question, saying that Reed is creating problems, quote, where none really exists. And then he goes on to say, for instance, he speculates in several places about why Hal Irving's Magic Lamp is the only story of the 13, it's really 12, in Canary in a Cat House that is not reprinted in Welcome to the Monkey House. Yet even a cursory reading of that story's clearly dated racist language and stereotyping creates embarrassment. It should come, therefore, as no surprise that Vonnegut dropped it from his second collection. Morse is admitting that the story is racist and that's why it's dropped, which of course doesn't quite explain it being reissued. Morse, unlike the more circumspect Reed, flat out acknowledges the story's racism, but defends it for being of its own time, and stated, before defending Vonnegut himself as a champion of racial equality, thus letting him off the hook for the overtly racist elements within the story he'd written. I think Morse protests a little too much, and the story is probably not as overtly racist as he thinks, although the offensive stereotyping of the Chinese and Black dialects are there. I do think it's notable that the offensive Chinese stereotyping remains in the self-bowdlerized edition that appears in Bagongba Snuff Box, as if Vonnegut really did have qualms with his racist imagery, but only with respect to one race. It is worse than Morse fears. Vonnegut did more than just try to explain away his use of racist language and imagery in Irwin's Magic Lamp. He tried to suppress it by including the tale in his handpicked selections for Canary in a Cat House. Vonnegut gave it a seal of approval, the imprimatur of the author's blessing. At the time, he would have had more than 24 other stories to choose from. So by including Hal Irwin as one of the 12, he was already being quite selective. By then excluding it and it alone from Welcome to the Monkey House, he had apparently saved imaginary censors the trouble of tacitly censoring that story, which, again, I would probably want to add is fine if Vonnegut had merely had a change of heart, felt embarrassed, or decided that this tale was not worthy of his readers' attention in 1968 and thereafter. That would certainly be fine. Changing it without attribution, arguably, is less valid and comes closer to what we think of as censorship or bowdlerization. As with some of the writings that he left unpublished entirely, Vonnegut's decision to lose Hal effectively rendered it a lost tale until Bagongba Snuff Box. And then he was, of course, given an opportunity to revisit his tale of the middle-class couple and their not-so-magic lamp. But contrary to expectation, if you buy Morse's argument that Vonnegut would prefer to leave the embarrassing tale behind, Vonnegut agreed to include it, and it in fact appears as the final tale in the volume if you read from cover to cover, therefore it'll be the last one you get. But the Hal Irwin's Magic Lamp that appears in the tale is completely different from the one that appeared in Cosmopolitan 42 years earlier. Decades after its publication, decades after its minor revision and minor exclusion, it gets thoroughly whitewashed. Without cataloging all the differences, which I know would be very tedious, let me just say the new version of the story cuts out the Amos and Andy styled Black dialect entirely, which is certainly understandable, and removes in advance, that potential complaint that I guess Morse would have had. In excising and rewriting the potentially racist dialogue, however, he does not rewrite it, giving the character a new way of speaking. Rather, he just removes all of her lines. Her formerly extensive dialogue is boiled down to a total of 6 words in the story. Thus, rather than amending the stereotypical racist language, he simply silences the character, the only Black character in the story. I should add, she becomes the only Black character in the story because he cut out a second Black character, Ella's husband, thus perplexingly and for no reason apparent in the main storyline that I can tell, turning her into an unwed mother, which seems to invite accusations of another form of potentially racist stereotyping. Mary's generous liberal sympathies lie entirely with Ella, whom she invites to live with them in the mansion. When the stock market crashes, Hal realizes Mary doesn't love him anymore and commits suicide. Mary returns to her father and to the family farm, and when she expresses concern for Ella and Ella's newborn baby, whom she's left behind at a church, her father reassures her in the story's new final line, quote, "The poor take care of the poor." Needless to say, perhaps, that even in this whitewashed version, Mary and her father do not imagine that they, white folks, would have anything to do with, quote, "the poor," here coded exclusively as Black and downtrodden. And yeah, it's a completely different, as I say, story. The bittersweet humor is certainly gone, replaced by an implacable gloom. Mary, and perhaps through her, the story itself, comes to represent the best that white liberal guilt can offer, which in the end is not much. A husbandless Ella, along with her child, is left with, quote, her own people at the church. Mary returns to her own people, I guess. A post-racial utopia this is not, nor does the author of this version seem to imagine that Mary and Ella, who had already been cohabiting, could continue to do so. Turning Ella Rice into an impoverished, unwed mother adds another level of pathos, but it also makes for a more stereotypical figure. If Morse is correct, and the natural reason to suppress the story is its dated racist language, that doesn't explain why in the 1990s, Vonnegut didn't mind keeping other seemingly racist dialogue intact. I mentioned the anti-Chinese racism left intact, and Vonnegut, in his own voice in the introduction to Bagombo Snuff Box, refers to the Japanese as little yellow bastards, as we used to call them. An entire thing on Vonnegut and Asian race could probably be its own topic. In the revised version of the story, Ella Rice doesn't get to speak direct discourse, but the narrator does inform us that, quote, everything Ella said was in a dialect typical of a person of her race and class and degree of education back then. What are we to make of such change? Arguably, the racial or racist stereotyping is just as bad, although the author's own use of dialect is mostly removed. Could it be that Morse and Reed are wrong, that this act of somewhat Orwellian censorship has little to do with race or gender? Honestly, I think so. And I think it's even worse than Reed or Morse believe. I think Vonnegut's desire to change the story had more to do with his own view that racism is intractable and thus not worth fighting. Ella Rice, the unwed mother left at a Black church with her people, is a little different than Ella Washington, who had a child in wedlock, a child who went on to become a doctor. But Ella Rice did live for a brief time happily with the kindly white folks who helped her out. Those white folks overcame their troubles in the earlier story to have a good marriage, to raise a fine child of their own in a stable middle-class family. Vonnegut did not alter his tale to remove dated racist language. He also wanted to make his story, in his view, more realistic with respect to race, thus denying the possible agency to a Black character on the grounds that Black people are not to be agents in such a racist society as ours. To put it another way, the earlier story was not so much too racist, although its language probably was, as too hopeful with respect to racism. By the 1990s, it's easier, it's clear from his comments in Hocus Pocus and Fate's Worse Than Death, novels he wrote in the, novel and a work of nonfiction that he wrote in 90 and 91 respectively, that his views on race had become pretty fatalistic and negative. In Fate's Worth and Death, he imagines an impending race war caused by Japanese neo-imperialism, by the way. And he writes that the race war would pit, quote, the Blacks, the Hispanics, the Irish, the Italians, the Asiatics, and the Nothings, which will include all those of German descent, like himself, against each other. In our time, the only white supremacists and those hoping to foster such race wars really imagine these sorts of scenarios. And since I know Vonnegut is not in their camps, I'll just chalk this up to his own depression and hyperbole. Whether that justifies the self-censorship of the historical and literary past is another question. I'm almost done, promise. One of the fundamental problems in need of further theorization and critique is what some have seen as Vonnegut's quietism. That is, Vonnegut's casual attitude towards various social horrors comes off as merely an acceptance of those horrors as natural and unchangeable. More, they sometimes come across as tacit endorsements of the specific social ill in question. A well-known example of this that is less problematized by race, say, or bigotry is from the first chapter of Slaughterhouse-Five, when he notes that an anti-war book might as well be an anti-glacier book, since war is inevitable and natural as glaciers. The fact that thousands of people are not likely to find themselves killed in a single night by encroaching glaciers makes Vonnegut's acquiescence to this rather inapt analogy all the more telling. Vonnegut is adept at identifying contemporary social problems and their baleful effects on himself and on others, but he seems all too willing to allow that they're inevitable, and thus that they're not really worth our effort in trying to solve. In the case of anti-Black racism in the United States, Vonnegut is disturbingly saturnine. Such an attitude also seems to prevail when the subject turns to gender equality, immigration, public health, the economy, and so on. To his credit, Vonnegut's good humor and goodwill, I believe, is often directed towards the ends of coping with the horrors of existence, and there is undoubtedly therapeutic value in learning to cope. However, there's also value in resisting intolerable conditions and in trying to change them for the better, something that Vonnegut, even when he's willing to compromise his artistic and professional principles, as with rewriting his own stories, may not be entirely willing to do. For all of his utopian predilections, Vonnegut's misanthropic humanism allows his imagination to reach only the threshold of another world, but ultimately he settles into the vale of tears and makes himself and his reader at home there. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
That was extremely interesting. I have so many questions I want to ask you after that, particularly with that anti-glacier statement. And again, I had no idea of the extent of the revisions that he did to that story. Fantastic. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess I'll go into mine and then we can open it up for questions. Okay. Mine is an even less well-known text, though from just a few years ago. It's an interactive piece in which you are able to make certain choices that affect the flow of the story. All right. Few digital compositions are actually investing paper text with such a literally magical aura, as Emily Short and Liza Daly do in their 2012 interactive fiction text, First Draft of the Revolution. Here, what readers get to do is to revise handwritten letters supposedly delivered by sorcery during, quote, an alternate history of the French Revolution. The text at first seems a classic example of remediation in J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin's definition, the representation of one medium and another, alternately displaying both their idea of immediacy and its access to the fictive letters and the hypermediacy of electronic cut and paste editing. But what makes the text so provocative is its interrogation of the politics of remediation, the cultivated nostalgia for earlier writing tech, by focusing on the gaps breaks and betrayals in medial translations that are theorized as, quote, correspondences, in ways that ask whether a truly revolutionary new medium is possible without replicating older power structures and inequities. The story, kind of soap opera-ish, of gendered and class selves versus others, supposedly set à Paris, not at, but to here, since Juliette, the low-born wife of a nobleman, Henri, has been exiled from Paris to his home province in the country. That punishment is ostensibly because she doesn't fit in with the sophisticated Parisian aristocracy, but it's also to use her as an unwitting agent to discover whether a certain young man in the village is the result of Henri's affair with a peasant woman. You throw into the mix a radical priest intent on using the young man as a weapon against the nobility, and the plot thickens. The reader or player's role here is to revise these letters, many from Juliette to Henri, but some of Henri's as well, and a couple from his sister or Juliette's former convent school mother superior. As Short writes, and this is a little unusual for interactive fiction, what you do here is reveal more of the character's personality with your revisionary choices, but you don't actually change the story's outcome. And that, again, is a little bit different. You know, even her own Galatea, for example, has tons of different endings based on your choices. What does this soap opera have to do with writing tech? The aristocrats in this alternative French Revolution stay in power because they alone have a genetic talent for a correspondence-based magic, where representations and copies faithfully transmit information across media. That's the entire premise of their society. Quote, mirrors reflect rooms in another province, models of the moon glow in phase. And for the story's literal correspondence, the letters, a pun that reveals how foundational inscription media are to this world's power structure. You write on one sheet of paper and those words magically, faithfully appear upon a correspondingly enchanted paper sheet in her husband's distant townhouse. All right, or do they? The correspondences, it turns out, are far from perfect. The piece is hypermediate, flawed, or disjunctive remedial transfers, flanked by the characters' debates over legitimate and illegitimate formats and users, not only remind us of historical subjects who lacked access to or control over successive media because of their gender or class, but also challenge how far marginalized subjects can rework those literacies once they do gain access. Rochelle Gold, who has a wonderful chapter on this piece in her dissertation, that's where a lot of stuff in interactive fiction is appearing now, in dissertations before they become books, concurs that literacy in this world is the basis of social power and notes the disjunctions between media forms. The letters, she says, that appear to receiver and sender at nearly the same time are really just a metaphor for email, point well taken. So therefore, she reads the concern over literacy as an allegory for digital literacy and the digital divide. If magic equals the ability to code, Juliette lacks that magic, but still asserts agency, albeit a constrained agency within patriarchy, and her empowerment comes at the cost of the lower classes, gender versus class. I appreciate that reading, but would like to go somewhat in an opposite direction. Why is this allegory of digital writing still so nostalgically obsessed with older book forms? If this is a romance, as Gold observes, the true romance is with the artistry of material inscriptions. And here I think I might jump into, let me just do a quick screen share. It might be useful to actually see some of these rich images. Okay. All right, let's go up slightly. Fantastic. All right, the first form that First Draft evokes is simply the handwritten page. There are a few lines of letters on this first page, also in the click button to send a particular letter, and the two words at the end with some calligraphic swirls, evoking text sold to the wealthy, not just those who are literate, but those who have the means to buy such ornately scribed text or to compose themselves in the best style of writing masters. In Japan and China, primarily nobles were the ones learning calligraphy. The calligraphy here, though, evokes at best kind of a simplified round hand. The correspondence stationary pages themselves, and this might be a little hard to see just from the screenshot, are also art objects. Now, it's possible that their, quote, magical aspect is simply superimposed by noble magicians. and that any selected paper could be so transformed. But the designer, Liza Daly's painstaking attention to these stationary pages makes them what Joanna Drucker would definitely consider erratic objects. In color, there are rich yellowy cream, perhaps to signify age. The edges often folded back, insisting on a tactile 3D appearance in protest against the screen's flat surface. Their quality attested to with elaborate, curvy, viney designs. You can kind of see that faintly here, etched into the surface. Each stationary design used by a single correspondent. Every sentence about this fictional paper speaks of superior privilege, wealth, leisure, and status. She, Juliet, plans her letters on ordinary pages, the ordinary a faint reminder perhaps of her own ordinary origins. But when they are ready, she copies them on paper whose enchanted double is hundreds of miles off. In other words, that's the one that's appearing in her husband's townhouse. Okay, this luxurious stationery elides not only its own production process, but the work of travel. Quote, no time is wasted on couriers. Juliet in exile still displays her own new wealth and status and spending too much money on fancy gloves to keep her hands smooth and supple, free from hard labor, before they take up the pen to respond to her noble husband. And the revision direction pointers are literally pointed to by a perfectly white, unsullied hand emerging from a ruffled dress sleeve. The hand's paleness denoting both leisure and raced marks of class status. The young noble boy, for instance, has blonde hair. The friar is always described with dark, quote, almost black features. The idea of the labor of writing itself is displaced in sentences like, the words form themselves on the matching sheaf in her husband's study, or another letter writes itself. Henri's impression when he receives a correspondence from his sister. Self-creating agency is reserved here apparently only for the language, while wealth and privilege get naturalized in the metaphor of writerly and biological lines, sexual, textual reproduction at its best. Henri gets out a pen that belonged to his grandfather and begins to write, read, his magic letter lines presumably as assured as this handheld phallic reminder of his noble ancestry. But the illusion of luxurious tactile materials delivered without work is of course immediately shattered. Quote, it is dangerous to deceive a husband of magic using rank, appears on a narrator stationery sheet that itself has a gorgeous background design, but the reader can't be deceived about these surfaces. We're invited to peer closely at the paper, but we can't, of course, finger the sheets, feel their thickness, or hold them to the light. And the quote, calligraphy is only the simulacrum of digital fonts. And even as the text continually teases us with details about handwriting, quote, Mother Superior had learned letters in Alsace and her penmanship bore Germanic quirks. There is the deliberately jarring choice, and you can see this in the screenshot, though it would not have been too difficult to sketch a simulacrum of handwriting, or at least continue in calligraphic fonts. There's the odd decision to make the letters appear as on the actual letter pages inexplicably in standardized print Times Roman font, revealing the fetishization of handwriting only as a nostalgic trope. Here, typeface dreams of handwritten intimacy. The whole point of this interactive text, moreover, as the title First Draft sets up, is to restore the labor behind the facade of effortless status. No Ginsberg style first thought, best thought here. All we do is cut, add, or rephrase. The program will not even let you send the letter until you have done the work of making a sufficient number of revisions. You can't just fast click your way through the text. Also, there is a few seconds delay between the final needed revision and the appearance of the tab, even allowing you to send the letter. Curiously, the sheets we compose and revise on are the exact ones we send. None of the quote ordinary versus magic paper division, the storyline spoke of, though the revision options given as a character's inner thoughts and headed by the command rewrite this do appear on smaller, plainer note pages. Let's see if we can do appear sort of on smaller, plainer note pages with a pin stuck through them. You can see that here. With a pin stuck through them superimposed on the fancy stationery page, 1 to 3 note papers, depending on the options that we digitally flip through. Again, the simulated materiality of showing the reverse side of a flipped page, symbolizing a desire to look back, the nostalgic remediation of this paper writing tech. The Mother Superior's own non-magical stationery looks very similar to what the nobles use, another factor that undercuts the supposed distinction between noble and ignoble writing materials. The naturalization or supernaturalization of effortless magic also breaks down at the plot level. Juliet is taught in the convent that, quote, the Lavori, that's the name for the type of, for the nobles' magic. The Lavori magic was given to the leaders of men by God. But there may be nothing inherently magic in noble genetics. They've simply intermarried and interbred till correspondence magic is concentrated among them. And Lavori simply means work in Italian, which can be used for everything ranging from theatrical art to hard labor. And not just any work, it's lavore d'arachne, what Mother Superior described as, quote, the mystical order of the weaver. Arachne, a non-mystical, fairly ordinary girl whose work challenged the gods' authority, exposing their weaknesses, an origin myth that betrays both the physical and mental effort by themselves and others needed to maintain the nobles' pretense of an effortless gift. Juliet doesn't understand the implications of this origin story when she's offended by a child using Lavori magic to repair a peasant fence. Illegitimate children like Henri's son can be welcomed into the aristocracy with an alacrity that betrays how far the bloodline's powers may be faltering. As Henri writes, few legitimate noble sons now demonstrate so strong a manifestation of the gift. We get too Henri's furious fear of being cuckolded to disrupt his familial narrative line. His sister Alice suggests how commonplace such concerns are. Quote, I believe I have discovered he was the father of the Pipe heir, she throws in as a casual bit of gossip in a letter. Even as she warns him that legitimate children can be easily disowned and disinherited by aunts who don't approve of their marriage alliances. Faithful transmission of correspondence information breaks down completely when Henri's translations, when Henri tries to decode a coded letter the friar sends about plans to seduce Juliet. With Henri's translations just getting cruder and cruder till he confesses his emotions have disrupted his ability, corrupt is his actual word choice, to read its message. Translation, though, is already a curious problem in this text. A Paris and lavore d'arachne are the few French phrases, or in the latter French plus Italian, that we even get here, except for personal and place names, with absolutely no explanation for why all the other words are written in English. That's alt history with an unusual vengeance, a suggestion, yes, that this might be an American or British caricature of the French Revolution, but also a warning of how far askew nostalgia for old forms, old privileges warps our sense of what really happened on the page or in the public squares. Another tech point that underscores that, while the reader can readily go back to the preceding page on any lexia, it's the revised text history only that we return to. In other words, whatever last revision you made, that's what we're going to go back to. And this resonates really interestingly, Rob, with all of your discussions of Vonnegut's revisions. If this were part of this text, we could only go back to the last revision. If you want to go back, the idea that the original, like Henri's translation, has been, quote, corrupted, a term interestingly used for both text and files. To retrieve the actual first draft, you have to reset the game and play it again from the beginning, which takes a lot of time. So if the breaks and contradictions around the idea of handwritten text expose all of these fallacies and noble lines, well, maybe the print fonts for the letters are a sign of progress in the remediation. Surely we're on good revolutionary footing, right? With the print metaphors and images that permeate the text. Here, after all, is Robert Darnton, who co-edited Revolution in Print. You have to think of old regime France as the patchwork of localities, authorities, privileges. It was a mess. The revolution tore it to bits, and out of the rubble rebuilt something new, the French nation. The printing press was the crucial instrument in this process. Without the press, the revolution was impossible and unthinkable. So what do we actually get in the icons? First draft borrows from printing that literally bookend this digital project. Here is the information page from the site. And then the lower picture would be the title page. Let's see, yeah, I did that, okay. The title page, after clicking begin. The cover page illustration, which is of a print workshop, does show the labor of printing, around which appear both the author and designer/company names, but pasted on an image of a deluxe, decorative, collectible looking book volume. The red of the future terror muted to the tasteful dull red of the inscribed leather, and the uppermost oval here presenting the monarchical fleur-de-lis and the divine sanction for this royal power, presided over by cherub and cross. In a stunning act of alt history, or at least selective print history, nowhere here are there mentions of Danton's points about the revolutionary role of the printing press. Yes, first draft is set in 1788 when the French press was still government censored prior to the revolution, but where are the foreign periodicals Jeremy Popkins mentions in his book Revolutionary News, or the Mémoires Secrètes, or the political pamphlets, or the Sentinelle du Peuple? Rather, the press's promise of rapid spread of news to all classes, as long as they could read, not an inconsiderable point, as Popkin notes, gets usurped by those luxurious proto-email correspondence sheets that the nobles have, tightly controlled by them, and always self-censored to conceal anything that might ruffle social or marital relations, euphemistically coded as directives to write, quote, more tactfully or delicately. Juliet thinks, I should not insult Henri's favorite village. Henri would laugh at that, or simply erase that might imply a criticism of the boy's noble parent. As the self-censoring demonstrates, the others in this text, the outsiders and rebels, are forced to, or choose to, use the same writing technology as the nobles. Juliet decides to side with her husband's noble family. Indeed, her most agential, independent act is tellingly impersonating his style and, quote, penmanship font, at least, in a letter, still in Times Roman, in a letter on at least the same stationery she's been using for her magical correspondences. The radical friar, whom Juliet speculates was himself an illegitimate noble son, definitely uses a magic correspondence paper, possibly to write to another nobleman he seduced, with the cover code supposedly a psalm from God's appointed King David, though we don't actually get psalm language. And although Henri's son, at the end of the story, now welcomed into the aristocratic family, smiles and tells them no magic will keep out enough enraged citizens determined to break the nobles' magic links. And we know that the friar is still out there somewhere plotting assassinations. The boy now seems perfectly content to enjoy his new privileges. As Juliet writes, quote, sometimes it appears the boy is very badly suited for our society. At other times, he is an ordinary young man. That word ordinary again, but here seeming to universalize it. Quote, pleased to be served his breakfast chocolate and to be winked at by the serving girls and to have coin for gambling with. In the end, she writes tellingly, I think these motives will pacify him. Let him spread the bloodline, in other words, with the servants, let him drink chocolate or eat cake, though Portal's shell would warn us that the cake is a lie, we still desire it, here to savor the fruits and high-end printmaking of others' labors. With enough time, will the boy learn to believe in the nostalgic conservative facade? In the end, Juliet writes, and the piece's end page gives another meaning to revolutionary, a grimmer one. To move forward beyond that last page, that the end comes back a 365-degree revolution to the luxurious cover page image with its fleur-de-lis. Reset the story as you wish, and that reset arrow is itself pointing backwards to the left, not forwards. Add nuances to each letter, make Juliet slightly more demanding or snarky, but the end doesn't change. Is this the author's warning about the limits, already well known, as Gold might say, of the revolutionary promises of our own digital tech? A sardonic gesture to the real French Revolution, which led to Napoleon and a new monarchy in between various republics? Either way raises provoking questions about how we will retell our own histories of revolutionary writing media to efface the privileges certain individuals and communities continue to retain. Okay, thanks. I'm going to stop the screen share and let's just talk about some of the questions that might have come up.
That's really fascinating. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question that will betray my age? Because I'm not used to the notion of this intermediality with respect to interactive text. And I guess it's, in a way, sort of a text/video game, right, in order to read it. But it reminded me a little bit of the choose your own adventure books of our youth, where it's like you get a choice and it says flip to page 99 if you choose to go in the cave, flip to page 212 if you chose to go down the road, right?
As a matter of fact, in my book art seminar, where I'm going to be teaching this, we do metafictional children's books. Yeah, and actually, I am of your generation, and this is some of this is student driven. I would begin, and the interactive fiction as a genre. I mean, yes, there's obviously a huge analogy toward both choose your own adventure print books, but also to games. Interactive fiction can be really minimalist, and Emily Short is like one of the pioneers in this genre. She's wonderful. Her Galatea, which is because I think she started out as a classicist. Anyway, that was the rumor. Her Galatea is a marvelous retelling, a modern retelling of that myth, in which the statue wakes up through divine intervention and it gets placed in an AI exhibit. And so a critic comes over to test out how, give her a Turing test basically, but she's an actual entity. And there is simply, you have lines of text and then the cursor. And you say hello to Galatea, and depending on what you do, different prompts come up. This is more elaborate. This is more visual, as you can see. She collaborated with a designer, and they do all these interactive games. So it's.
But it does have to be read on a computer, of course, right?
It does. It does. And I think some of the most interesting books in this genre, like the metafictional print books that do you choose your own adventure, or like Rory's The Raging Tide, actually point up the limitations of the genre. Here, you don't get a different ending, and I find that intriguing. Same with Andrew Pluck and Shade. No matter what you do, the ending is the same bleak, you're dying in the desert.
Yeah, this seems like it would have really fascinating implications for like theory of the novel and stuff like that, narratology in general, I suppose.
Yeah, and it is literally built for remediation, because the first time I read it, I thought, oh, cool, it's this frothy little piece, dangerous liaisons in a smaller version. But then I'm like, wait a second. There is, all of these, it makes no sense to do the handwritten letters. There's some truly weird stuff going on. And she actually did it. And she talks about it. She wanted to do a game about writing and writing tech.
Yeah.
And some of it is just so egregious that I have to assume that on the designer's part as well, there were some very deliberate choices to do things that made no sense.
Well, yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, like, some like deconstruction types would have a field day with it as well. Especially though, I was thinking when you were talking about the magical letters appearing, transporting themselves across great distances onto other pages. Lots of fun to be had there.
And that's one of the reasons I decided to teach this both undergrad and grad level, because it's just ready-made for theory. Pick your theory. This works. Right. This works so well with all this stuff. I want to hear more about how you got interested in the amazing revisions that you've tracked on that story. And then I totally want to ask you about the whole free will thing.
Okay, the story itself, I was not, I guess I was interested in, I was interested in the question of sort of self-censorship, and I mentioned the Mark Twain stuff. I had written a little bit on Twain, and one of the things that happened, I'm sure you remember vividly, some of especially in the 80s, there was a real brouhaha about a school in Fairfax, Virginia, which was actually, I think, called Mark Twain Middle School or something, where a teacher, a Black male teacher, condemned the text and wrote an op-ed, I think, to the Washington Post, and it became a national story. And I think that guy actually later, the school teacher in question, with some press, issued a version of Huckleberry Finn changing the N-word to maybe Black or I'm not sure exactly. But I thought about it in that terms, not so much because I'm going wholeheartedly into the we should never censor versus we maybe should, but it's strangely enough, the debates really didn't pit sort of liberals versus conservative. It pit sort of liberals of goodwill who were quite anti-racist against Black parents and students who were feeling offended. And so it was this odd mix of people who were all sort of on the same team, but you had a really weird position of like, white people telling black people to shut up because this is good for you, you know, and it therefore went against what I'm sure is their actual politics, but their love of literature and whatnot caused them to be in that weird position. And so it was only sort of through the back end I approached that with Vonnegut. Vonnegut had already made a name for himself as a great champion of free speech, and a lot of his public speeches were about it. And so I found it very odd when Peter Reed mentioned that this had been a sort of racist story. By the way, Vonnegut, and I'm not criticizing him for this too harshly. I mean, I think part of it is his age and where he comes from, but I mean, he has a lot of racist caricatures. It's obvious that he, you know, unlike Faulkner, you know, famously, Morrison said Faulkner may have been racist, but at least he took black people seriously. And it's because undoubtedly Faulkner knew black people very well. And I feel like Vonnegut is sort of anti-racist, but knew no black people. And so he used lots of sort of racial stereotypes and didn't take the characters very seriously. In some of his writings, that can be kind of offensive. I mean, in Breakfast of Champions, he uses the N-word, and not only uses it, but says this is the word we use to refer to black people, not the word racist used to refer to black people. And I remember I taught a class on Vonnegut years ago, and you know, one of my students who was black just said, you know, I've been putting up with his racism all semester, but I mean, when I got to this, I just couldn't take it anymore. And so that was part of it too. I know that he's a good liberal and that he's, of course, an anti-racist in his own heart of hearts. But what a strange thing that he would, you know, do this and then rewrite one of his own stories. And so I dug up I had to get it through interlibrary loan. Nothing's digitized. Maybe it's on microfiche somewhere or something, but the old Cosmo magazines, which I, of course, knew nothing about, you know, back when they used to publish stories. Vonnegut published 6 or 7 stories, I think, in Cosmo. They paid a lot of his bills in the 50s. And, you know, it's obviously meant to be a sort of lighthearted, domestic, you know, almost like a sitcom that you don't need to ever watch again. It's not meant to be, you know, great art exactly. But the fact that he had then reprinted it and that Peter Reed, you know, talked about why he chose not to reprint it, made that one really stand out for me. And then when I compared them side by side, like I said, it's not minor edits to remove the racist language. It's a really completely rewritten story. And as I said at the end, and I hope it made sense because I realized I cut it down from a longer paper. You know, it's almost more despondent with respect to race relations. The earlier story might have been more overtly racist, but, you know, the black woman is happy and raises her son to become a doctor. And, you know, there's a lot of, you know, happy ending to the story. Whereas in this, Hal Irwin kills himself. They become so impoverished that they drop, you know, Ella and her newborn child off at a church somewhere as a charity case and just abandon them to the notion that, yeah, well, it may be hopeful, I suppose. You could say the poor take care of the poor, but again, considering they've sort of abandoned the poor to that other place. And so that's what, I'm sorry, that's a very rambling answer, but that's what got me interested in this very odd choice. I mean, I think if he had simply left it out or included it and put a note saying, look, this story is pretty racist and pretty glib, and I apologize, but you can put that note in there. The fact that he chose to rewrite it just struck me as a little bit, well, unethical. You know, it's more or less saying, you know, here's the story, even though I changed it.
And is selective about not taking out something like, you know, the book by, what was it, not Campbell, in Slaughterhouse-Five, that said that there was many casualties that turned out to be from the sort of Nazi sympathizer source.
Wait, did they change that?
I don't think they have.
I don't think they did, yeah.
I've taught. And you know,
and that's of course really embarrassing one, because yeah, that guy, I just saw the movie, by the way, Denial, which is about that guy going on trial. Starring Rachel Weisz as a Jewish studies professor. Anyhow, the movie's good. I recommend it.
Denial?
Yeah, the movie, I think it's just called Denial because this guy is accused of being a Holocaust denier. And then he is a Holocaust denier, but he sues her for libel, and
Yeah.
does so in England, where you can sort of do that. First Amendment really protects us here, but then the whole thing winds up being the trial, and the feeling that is the Holocaust itself on trial, or if he wins his case, does that mean Holocaust deniers win? And so the movie is quite dramatic. I guess it too was based on a book. But I recognized his name and it's like, oh wait, that's the guy that Vonnegut cites in Slaughterhouse-Five.
And
And
did
of
not
course,
change even when his attention was called to it. What drives me a little nuts with trying to pin down his position in some of these books, as opposed to the stuff he said publicly, but within the texts themselves, is that he plays so thoroughly that classical role of the Iron, where it's constantly you're on the attack and your own position is never supposed to be completely visible. And even the exchange with the press agent, where he faithfully parrots the, yes, it's as good as writing an anti-glacier book, but he writes the book. And, So It Goes, for instance, that's Billy Pilgrim, that's the Tralfamadorians, and his metonymic play with, Blue and Ivory showing up on the feet of the corpse and the feet of Billy Pilgrim, making the point that Billy's living his life so passively, he's acting like he's dead. In other words, that fatalism seems to be part of the satire. It is very hard to come down on, where to locate his position. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit,
no, and I would actually agree with that. I think that, I mentioned this, in my book, because I talk about the influence, or at least the correspondence, perhaps, because I don't know if it's causal, between Vonnegut and sort of existentialism. And obviously in existentialism, there is at least a Sartrean kind of existentialism, this sense of sort of anxiety, anxiousness, nausea that comes with free will. And Vonnegut, in many of his books, has variations on the theme of free will versus a kind of fatalism, whether it's Tralfamadorian time, where everything's happened already, and all moments are at the same time, which I thought worked really well with a Nietzschean eternal return kind of theory. Or in some of the books, it's mechanical, like people are basically robots, and therefore you can't blame them for what they do because they're just going to do it. In Slapstick, he makes reference to how anxious people are because they don't know they don't know the drill, and they want to know. And he compares it to those, you'll know, they used to have these mats that they'd put down in dance studios so you know where to put your feet, and it shows the ... where you move your foot next. And he said in Slapstick, he says that that's what most people really want. They just want to know, like, what they want that decided for them. But it's also in Slapstick where he flat out says that after the revolution that has destroyed the United States and reimposed slavery, that the happiest people are the slaves, the ones who volunteered to become slaves, because then they didn't have to have free will anymore. And now they sing songs in the fields. And of course, for any of us in American studies, we know, I mean, Frederick Douglass talks about how the singing of songs is not a sign of happiness. And so it's very, very tough to read him saying that, wouldn't it be nice that we could be slaves and wouldn't have to think for ourselves anymore? And I realize there's irony in that, but it's also, I think it's one of the reasons why, even though Vonnegut has always called himself a socialist, that not many leftists can really get behind him. They like him, but they just don't find his work politically useful. And I don't just mean in an activist sense. I mean, he leaves you sort of troubled about what we're going to do. And I guess I just wanted to get at that. The other thing is just me being crabby old man, seeing all these memes. I saw one just the other day that was obviously a false quote. It wasn't by Vonnegut at all, but it sounded, cool and wise. And so people want to say that Vonnegut said that, but it's like years ago, the wear sunscreen monologue that was getting credited to Vonnegut, even though it was written by a journalist in Chicago, I think.
Did you ever get a chance to meet Vonnegut?
I did not. No. I wish I had. I really do. He sounds like somebody who would have been happy to meet scholars or just fans. He seemed very available.
I met him once.
Do tell.
Yeah, I met him. It was a weird. It was Vonnegutian, in that when would this be? 92, 93. I was living in Iowa with my wife at the time, and I was trying to publish a novel, and had interest from an agent, a guy named Stuart Richardson, who back then, digging up stuff on somebody was a challenge. And so we had this conversation on the phone, and it was like, yeah, I went to the Soviet Union and I became Gorbachev's editor, and I was Updike's editor, and I had to do like LexisNexis searches, if you remember. And because
I remember that
I'd worked as a paralegal, so and I was like, well, I'm going to come to New York City and meet you, and we had lunch at I want to say it was the Athenaeum Club in Manhattan, and I was having lunch with Stuart Richardson, and I looked across the restaurant, and there was Vonnegut, and he was sitting and with like what I guess was his entourage of editors and so forth, his publicist or whatever. And it was weird because the night before I'd watched Slaughterhouse-Five on television in the hotel room. Mm-hmm. And it was like there was nothing on, and I was really tired, and I was alone. I didn't feel like braving the streets of New York. I had this meeting, so I just stayed in and watched. Slaughterhouse-Five was on, and I liked that. I was into Vonnegut, and then there's Vonnegut, and so we ended up leaving the restaurant we ended up getting in the line to get our coats back at the coat check area in the Athenaeum Club. And I was directly behind him. And so I said, Mr. Vonnegut, I just want to shake your hand. I'm a big fan of your work. Do you have any advice for a young writer starting out? And Vonnegut said, when you go to a college, make sure you find out in advance, like what sports team they're proud of, so that when you get caught in a boring conversation with somebody, you can change the topic by saying, how's the basketball team doing? And I said, thank you very much, Mr. Vonnegut. I'm sure that'll come in handy one day. And that was the conversation.
That's awesome.
That is awesome.
That's awesome. Well, of course, I went to Duke, where all we care about is basketball. So it actually would work if you ever find yourself speaking at Duke.
Right. Yeah, no, that's weird, because then after that, I bit the bullet and went back and got my PhD. I'd gotten my master's at NYU from 88 to 90. And then in the fall of 94, I matriculated at Duke. So yeah, I'm a product of the Duke PhD.
Were you in English or in Lit?
I was in English.
Okay.
I ended up, it's one of the things that I think gives me some perspective on being the director of this conference, is that I actually ended up thinking when I got, and I was, again, I was married, I was older, and I thought there would be a lot of people like me, but actually at that point in the mid 90s, it was all these people straight out of Harvard and Stanford, all of whom had been like fed the right name drop things to put in their
Yeah.
writing sample,
Yeah.
you know, knowing that Damon was out, but Derrida, you know, I mean, it was,
Right.
and it was, and that's what they were all young, and about most of them dropped out very quickly, frankly. And
Yeah.
yeah,
I
but I
was
was
just going to
going to
ask
study with Lantrechia, with
who had
Franklin.
stopped doing
Right.
criticism at that point.
I got there, and I'd read Edge of Night, and which was his memoir at the time, and he had just done that. A literary critic turns in his badge piece, and the older grad students that were there were like, don't even try, you know. And so at that point I realized that you just go with who you gel with, frankly. And I gelled with Stanley Fish, and I ended up doing a dissertation on Milton and becoming an early modernist. But I thought I was going to go there and you know, and do 20th century literature, frankly. But it just didn't make sense.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and I don't mean to derail our subject. I was an undergrad there, 87 through 91, and then I went back to law school, 99 to 2001. But I also grew up, my dad went to Duke. So I grew up in North Carolina, a Duke fan, like coming to the football games because we couldn't get basketball tickets. So watching the basketball on TV, watching football games in person. And of course, I had been a philosophy major undergrad, taking a lot of courses in the lit program. Jameson in particular was the guy who really introduced me to theory and who introduced me to the kind of work that I went on to do. But as such, I never really, it's strange, I'm in an English department now, but I never took any classes in the English department. I took one class with Michael Moon, who I think shortly thereafter, went to Emory. But
Right.
he was still, I took a great American Lit class with him. But I am curious because the reputation of English in the 90s was that after the initial effervescence of Fish coming in the 80s and all the hiring, that, something happened in the mid 90s. And it sounds like part of it was, like you're saying, the students were different, maybe some of the attitudes that ossified, but I'd love to learn more about your experience of that. But it sounds like we wouldn't have been there at the same time. I would have just missed you before and after.
Yeah, no, you're right. Although Jameson was the outside reader on my dissertation.
Oh, cool.
And I was the thing is, I could get along with Fish in the sense that, as one East Coast Jew, his father was an electrician. He grew up in Providence. He liked the Red Sox, and he wrote on a typewriter still, often while watching a game, and famously played basketball. And I understood this personality. I felt comfortable with. I used to say that Fish was my Jewish father and Jameson was my Goyish father, because this is just like some sort of supercomputer to me. I was in awe of Jameson. I took 2 classes with him, and at that point, if you got nothing better to do, if you go through the Louisville LCLC stuff, I've been doing a podcast that I'm doing as an oral history of the conference. And so I've got 2 episodes with Fish on it. And I asked them, because when I did my defense, and I'll always remember the defense because Jameson asked me a question about Walter Scott. And I just, to this day, there's always that book that you're like, I know I need to read that, but I'm gonna read Call It Sleep instead, you know? And I
Lukács is
just,
the historical novel.
yeah,
That's how we know.
I just couldn't do it, man. And I don't know if you ever took a class with Bob Gleckner, but Bob Gleckner was the glue of that department, actually, to get back to your question. Gleckner was one of the old guard that was there before Fish. The thing is, in the podcast, what I do is I said to Fish that after that defense, the other graduate students, the older ones in particular, told me like, wow, that must have been the first time Fish and Jameson were in the same room together. And, you know, and there was this perception that, you know, Fish was just this money chasing, you
Right.
know, showboat, and Red Fred was Red Fred. And I said to him, what was your relationship with him? And he goes into this thing, well, we chose to go to Duke together, and we vacationed together, and we, you know, and,
Yeah,
you know,
I saw them
all
in a room
that.
together a lot when I was in college.
Yeah, you know, we got along. And what I said to him was, they, to me, Fish was like a great singles band, you know, and Jameson was like the concept album. You know, Jameson does like The Wall, and Fish is over there, you know, the Beatles in their early phase, you know, where you just need the greatest hits thing and you're good. And he liked that. He was like, yeah, that's exactly right. And but the Gleckner was a Blake and Byron scholar, and was a World War, like Vonnegut. He was a World War II B-29 bombardier, the guy who did the targeting. You know, he was that guy, and he and I just really got along, again, for that same reason. My dad's a vet and Korean War vet. And I know that personality type, you know, and Gleckner actually, he still had a large, I mean, big cut glass ashtray, and he always smoked Benson and Hedges, the gold pack, and kept a bottle of scotch in the bottom drawer of his, so that when the job list came out, he looked at me and said, you need a drink. And I mean, that age of where like you sat down and had a shot and drank you know, and smoked a cigarette with your, you know. But Gleckner got along with everybody. I mean, everybody loved Gleckner. And yeah, and people would be like, you need to be the chair. You're the guy, you know, you're the guy, you're the glue of the department. And he was like, I'm too old and you people are too factious and I'm not dealing, you know, I'm not dealing with it. But yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, people blamed Mariana Turgovnik for being a bad chair. And I think people blamed Eve Sedgwick, weirdly enough, because, you know, she was just sort of letting in only, I mean, she wanted queer theorists and nobody but queer theorists, and yet other people need to get fed graduate students. And so there was a lot of bitterness there. It just was, you know, it was a soap opera.
Yeah, I mean, I only heard it like, you know, third, fourth, fifth hand, but, you know, this sort of story of, you know, this you know, decline of the English department. I mean, the quality of the English department, I'm sure, remained high. It's just that it seems like everybody there was incredibly unhappy.
Right. You know, it's hard for me. I mean, you know, I mean, honestly, when I did feel, because I got out in 98, I already had a master's and I was married and I had a kid, and I felt like, you know, the old Jewish joke, sort of, now things could be worse, I could be younger. You know, it was like, let's get out while there's still jobs to get. And
Right.
you know, so, and I was older. I'd already when I wrote my application to get into Duke, I just thought Duke, like, like Michigan's good, ACC is good. I didn't know anything about like the whole thing. I was just reading Vonnegut and stuff like that, but I was obsessed with Hart Crane at the time, and I wrote this paper about how I thought Hart Crane's late poems that nobody reads are the seeds of Frank O'Hara's style. And so she thought she was getting a homo poetics guy, and to the end she was like, I know you better than you know you. And we got along, and she was like my Jewish mother there, and I really loved Eve, frankly. But but I understood why people, I wasn't she wasn't on my committee. I didn't want anything out of her. And and that actually sort of suited her to a T, you know what I mean? Like, you don't want anything out of me? Like, no, I just want to talk about musicals with you,
Right.
And we got along fine, but it just, when Fish came in 2006 to Louisville, I remember driving him around, and I said to him, like, he comes in like 84 or something, and I go like, Duke University English Department, 84, and he goes, uh-huh. I go, to 98. This is when he left and went to be dean at University of Illinois Chicago.
Right.
And he said, yeah. And I said, hell of a run.
Yeah.
And he said, that's what people don't get. I mean, I kept that house together for like over a decade, like, do you know how hard that is? And what it's like to feed prima donnas? And,
Well, and to his credit, I do get the sense that before he got there, it was pretty toxic. Like, he was saying that one of the medievalists didn't get along with the person who was in charge of like the Italian exam. And so people had to go to Carolina to get their Italian requirement if they wanted to study medievalists.
right.
Just too many like personal prima donna stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I learned a lot from him. I mean, like like Fish, for example, Fish never, because he was a guy who was like, I've got 3 offices, like, he was that kind of guy. And because he had an office over in the law school, and and then he had an office, and it was 2 offices. So he had his administrative crew here, and then he had his office here. And I used to go and hang out with the other grad students in that outer office. And anytime he conducted business, anytime he was in his office, he never shut the door, never. And anytime there was any business going on, you know what I mean? Like, any business going on, his door was open, and he kept that door open so that in terms of the power dynamics and the stuff that could go on, like, nobody could say on Fish, because the door was open. And I heard him do things like he understood the difference. He could say to somebody, like, going up from associate to full. And I swear to God, this is a true story. And I learned from it that he said, I wasn't that impressed with your last book, but you did put it out, and other people were impressed with it, and it got good reviews, and let's get you paid.
Right.
I'm in your camp, and then he said, next time, write one more that I might like. And the ability to separate that out, like Frank Lantrecchio was like, you're a sellout, but as an administrator, I mean, I thought he was very smooth, frankly, and in a good way,
Mm.
So, because I watched it all I mean, he never shut the door. The door was always open. So as people were going in and out, and he was dealing with the issues, he'd deal with issues in the hallway,
Yeah.
And he was like, it's public, man. We're a department, there's no secrets with me, you know what I'm doing. I think that, so there was a touch there. Fish was good at that. So, but
Well,
I've hijacked the
yeah,
conversation.
maybe we should. Well, I guess we
So let me
probably
ask
should
you-
wrap it up.
Yeah, Susan, let me ask you one question before we,
Sure.
how did you hear about this? Because I did go online and look at the interactive text that you were that you wrote and was that you wrote about. How did you hear about it? Because I'm just not familiar with that space at all, really.
Yeah. One word, or actually three, the electronic literature collection,
Mhm.
pandemic teaching, and here are all these free, brilliant texts online. And so I ran into Emily Short. I think Galatea is in the first volume, and I started getting really interested in her because I teach cyborg classes, and I was like, Galatea is perfect for that.
Mhm.
And then I started looking into some of her other stuff. And like I said, the first time this one, First Draft of the Revolution is volume 3. And I think that, I'd like to acknowledge somehow just the fact that so many of these authors are willing to put this up, no paywall, to make these texts, accessible, I think is extraordinary acts of generosity. And I came across them, I was like, I haven't seen this one, and but there's just a wealth of things on that site, and I use whatever I can, and then it's a springboard because then you start looking into, I ran into Porpentine that way. Then it's like, oh, cool, what else has she done?
Right. Yeah, one last. Let me ask you a follow-up before we say goodbye, and we can talk more when you come to Louisville in a year. Does your interest, because with Choose Your Own Adventure, yeah, I mean, I remember that, and that sort of thing. But are you interested in just sort of going fully over into the role playing, where you kind of dispense with this middle ground and just fully go into Second Life and these kind of immersive, imaginative role playing game? Is that something? Is that part of what you do?
If I were better at these things, if I'd started earlier, probably. But right now, I focus on sort of the more literary ones, or particularly the ones that feature poetry, which I'm just fascinated by. Look, a student told me recently that there was a genre called comics poetry a year ago, and now I teach it. And what happens to sort of digital poetics? What happens when you move away from the page screen? So it's the literary stuff. It's the interactive fiction. It's the hypertext patchwork stuff like Shelley Jackson's, Patchwork Girl. That's where the love lies. But I'm sure if I got hooked on some of these games, and actually a lot of Porpentines are really games, even though half of them she calls poems. I find fascinating where the line breaks down. But lots of my students write on postmodern, games that clearly do all sorts of cool postmodern stuff, and are just perfect for those kind of theoretical readings. I'm not sure I have the gaming chops, but it's something that I'm very interested in. But I tend toward more the literary end of it. So if a game has lots of great stuff, I'll be in it.
Right. Yeah, I do, because as I was saying, I ended up, in terms of the historical beat that I walk, I do the Shakespeare and that sort of stuff. And with when I do the Shakespeare classes, and I mean, this is that sense where, if I never thought we'd arrive so quickly, but when the Jefferson County Public Schools, and Louisville is in Jefferson County, when they lift the Shakespeare play requirement in high school, right now they still have to do 2 units, one in 10th grade, one in 12th. And when you're working with the teaching students, they have to like summarize the play because they can only give them like little snippets of it because they only got like 2 weeks to go through it. But when they lift that requirement, and then the ed school lifts the requirement that if you want to get certified to teach middle or high school, you need to take a class in Shakespeare. The Shakespeare classes, I don't think we're going to make anymore at the University of Louisville. But, I've just totally, I mean, what I do in terms of some sort of project for my Shakespeare class. If it isn't teaching materials, and for most of them it's, oh, I could do a lesson plan, you know, I let them do that. But then if they're not doing that, then they love to do role-playing game modules where they take Macbeth or Julius Caesar, and they turn it into you know, a role-playing game thing, and I say, bring the dice and we're going to play it, you know, and we do, and so that, and I wasn't into that stuff, but you know, through them, I've gotten into that stuff because that's what they want to do. If they don't want to teach it, you know, they want to play it.
Once they have to, if they're constructing some of this themselves, they have to think about authorial, they have to think about the constraints that are built into the work. In other words, what can you have Macbeth do and still stay within the textual premise that Shakespeare has set up?
Right.
Yeah, students can do all sorts of wonderful work.
They do that, although there are these other, there's a role-playing game that's called like Villains, and that some of my kids are into, and there they go like, okay, Professor Biberman, here's a character sheet. Now you get to choose. Do you want to be Iago? Do you want to be Macbeth? Do you want, you know, and then it's like a Star Trek fantasy like deck, you know, where they then drop you in, and you know what I mean, and then you get to like pick your henchmen and go, you know, steal from Joker, you know, and so they do that too, you know, so it depends on, you know what I mean, like
I let them do this stuff as end projects in my book arts classes. Look, I had a student do a brilliant literary piece as an online game in which you wound up, it was a Borges-based piece on the library, and you wound up revealing yourself as the man of, or the person of the book.
Yeah.
And this is fantastic. It's a wonderful way to get them to engage it. And some of it is just remarkable. I keep trying to get our department to say, when you have a fiction contest or a poetry contest, you need to include some of this mixed media stuff.
Yeah.
This is super cool. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I'm gonna have to run, but
yeah, no, we've gotten to the witching hour. So thanks so much. It was fun to get to know.
Yeah, it's great to meet you, Matthew, and of course Susan.
Yeah, Robert.
Thank you so much.
And
yeah, hopefully in Louisville in person next time.
Yeah, let's do it. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.